The Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Treaty of Niagara, 1764. The history of treaty-making in Canada is contentious. Aboriginal peoples and the Crown have interpreted the spirit and intent of the treaties quite differently. Generally, government officials have viewed the treaties as legal mechanisms by which Aboriginal peoples ceded and surrendered their lands to the Crown. In contrast, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples understand treaties as a sacred obligation that commits both parties to maintain respectful relationships and share lands and resources equitably. Indigenous peoples have kept the history and ongoing relevance of the treaties alive in their own oral histories and legal traditions. Without their perspectives on the history of treaty-making, Canadians only know one side of this country's history. This story cannot simply be told as the story of how Crown officials unilaterally imposed treaties on Aboriginal peoples. They were also active participants in treaty negotiations. The history and interpretation of treaties and the Aboriginal-Crown relationship, as told by Indigenous peoples, enriches and informs our understanding of why we are all treaty people. This is evident, for example, in the story of the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and its relationship to the Treaty of Niagara in 1764. The Royal Proclamation, which was issued by colonial officials, only tells half the story. On October 7, 1763, King George III issued a royal proclamation by which the British Crown first recognized the legal and constitutional rights of Aboriginal peoples in Canada. In the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the British declared that all lands west of the established colonies belonged to Aboriginal peoples and that only the Crown could legally acquire these lands by negotiating treaties. At a time when Aboriginal people still held considerable power and conflicts with settlers were increasing, British officials sought to establish a distinct geographical area that would remain under the jurisdiction of Indigenous nations until treaties were negotiated. Anishinaabe legal scholar John Burroughs notes that the Royal Proclamation can be fully understood only in relation to the Treaty of Niagara, in which the terms of the proclamation were ratified by Indigenous nations in 1764. As Burroughs explains, the Indigenous leaders who negotiated the Treaty of Niagara with the Crown did so with the understanding that they would remain free and self-determining peoples. Burroughs observes, "The proclamation uncomfortably straddled the contradictory aspirations of the Crown and First Nations when its wording recognized Aboriginal rights to land by outlining a policy that was designed to extinguish these rights. The different objectives that First Nations and the Crown had in the formulation of the principles surrounding the proclamation is the reason for the different visions embedded within its text. Britain was attempting to secure territory and jurisdiction through the proclamation, while the First Nations were concerned with preserving their lands and sovereignty." The Royal Proclamation was ratified by over 2,000 Indigenous leaders who had gathered at Niagara in the summer of 1764 to make a treaty with the Crown. The treaty negotiations, like earlier trade and peace and friendship treaties, were conducted in accordance with Indigenous law and diplomatic protocol. John Burroughs presents evidence that Aboriginal peoples, some 54 years after the Treaty of Niagara was negotiated and ratified, still remembered the promises that were made by the Crown.